So, good evening, all, and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Council's Economy, Place, Access and Transport Scrutiny Committee. We have a fairly light agenda tonight, which is a shame, and I wasn't hoping for this to be the case, but it is where we are. Hopefully this won't happen again. But the one main item that we do have is a very interesting one, looking at York's gender pay gap. So before we get on to that, we'll run through the earlier agenda items. I don't have any apologies. I believe Councillor Jane Burton is imminently on, well, there we go, entering the room as we speak. So we have a full house of regular members. I should say, just for members' awareness, really, I'm quite heavily dosed up on painkillers tonight, so I might not be my usual exceptional self. So cut me a little bit of slack if you can. Do we have any declarations of interest? No. Okay. Good stuff. And the minutes from the previous meeting, do colleagues have any comments on those? No. Okay. Well, I'll sign them off once I get my hands on a pen. Oh, look at that. Poetry in motion. Thank you. Which then brings us to public participation. And we have one speaker tonight. That's Gwen Swinburne. Gwen, you're very familiar with the drill. I won't be too rigid on the 3 minutes, so no need to rush yourself, but fire away whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Chair. I'm speaking on the work plan. As a former head of economic development, I have made no secret of the entirely inadequate so-called economic strategy you inherited. This, combined with the departure of the incumbent manager, the new mayor's economic development team, and our perilous financial situation, mean we need an urgent scrutiny. May I propose that this scrutiny includes an assessment of the pros and cons of combining economic development services with the combined authority, and then, either way, a full review, ideally a complete rewrite of the economic strategy reflecting your policies and values. Secondly, Chair, I note your proposed budget includes identifying assets for disposal. This again is serendipitous. Our industrial and commercial land and property assets are very significant indeed. I wrote to you last December, followed up in January, sharing examples of some really useful property portfolio performance reporting from other local authorities, as I do. Senior management told me the council held most of such data, both by property and by portfolio type. Chair, for years I have been asking for a property asset committee of some kind. It has fallen on stony ground. There have been no performance reports of any sort, regular or otherwise, that I have been able to find. I don't even recall an internal audit. Considering, other than staff, our property is our largest asset, members will recognise this significant governance and oversight shortcoming. I hope you will request an urgent scrutiny report. Now is the time to do it. Our property assets could be disposed of in a rational and transparent way, with members for the first time being able to properly scrutinise officer disposal proposals, as should be. Chair, we know the scrutiny function is failing you and us miserably, today's agenda being a case in point, if I might say. But there are two reports these two reports, the scrutiny would and should do and should be done ahead of any decisions that you make. I would please ask that in your work plan, considerations that you ask the responsible officers to prepare these reports and that they be programmed in today, not just added to the list. My personal opinion, for what it's worth, is that the property performance report should be submitted to you every year, as well as to the responsible executive member. Thankfully, the Chief Finance Officer now has responsibility for this function, as I understand. That's the conclusion of my remarks, Chair.
Thank you very much for that, Gwen. Take the points you've raised, and we'll hopefully get into that in the work plan item on this agenda. Thank you for your time once again. Cheers. So, colleagues, that brings us to the main item on the agenda, which is looking at York's gender pay gap. It's a fairly short sort of initial starting report, which will hopefully, inspire a bit of a discussion on what might be done to improve things. But by the looks of it, York as a council fares quite well. So welcome to the table, Claire Fold. Again, you're very familiar with the drill. If you could give a sort of brief overview of the paper, which we'll take as read, and then we'll get into members' comments and questions. Be grand. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Claire Fold, Chief Strategy Officer. Thank you for inviting us to present today the gender pay gap in York. I realise that when I shared the report with you, I didn't explain the duty on employees of 250 or more who are required to report on the gender pay gap once a year. That's by the 31st of March for the public sector and before the 4th of April for the private sector. 43 businesses publish for York, including the City of York Council. Because of the timings, because we're in February, we're actually reporting on last year's data. So obviously we've got a picture for last year where CYC has a negative gap with 2023 figures just published, which shows that women are slightly paid more than men, with a negative gap of around minus 0.8%. There are 3 other organisations with a negative pay gap in York, which is fantastic. 2 companies that are part of the Nestle Group, and then Brit Safe Cleaning and Security, as well as ourselves. With 43 organisations also reporting across the across the city, it's worth noting that the city's gender pay gap as a whole is £84.90 a week, or 12.5%. This is less than the national gap of £97.80, so it's not an issue to York alone. However, it is of course concerning. There are many reasons for gender pay gap. They're nuanced and they're complex. It includes unfair pay practices, the gendered nature of child or elderly care, cultural bias, that includes bias around leadership potential, and an uneven distribution of part-time employment, particularly in York, of course, with 5,000 plus households relying on part-time or self-employment, and 2/3 of the part-time work typically women, who typically work with 40% working less than 30 hours a week. Some work's been done in the economic team to address this and to work with through UKSPF funded programmes such as the Courageous Female programme, which supported female entrepreneurs, the Momentique Start and Grow programme, and the Supporting Women Networks across York, as well as many independent women networks in York, such as York's got the only Women in Rail Tech group, which is obviously works with and into the very successful rail cluster we've got here. However, this isn't going to be some monumental policy change. Change will only happen through individuals, not in one foul swoop. Through each woman and through each company that they work for. There are, however, some considerations that employers can take. The New Eras for Female Entrepreneurship report that was published recently sets out some of those considerations. And obviously we can talk about more today. I think I'll stop there and open up for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Claire. Do any colleagues want to kick us off? Okay, get my queue going. I've got Councillor Stewart, then Councillor Benson, then Councillor Whitcroft. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Chair. So on the table on page 7, I'm not sure how good the data is. From the point of view, it says for everything, it's got collection frequency of annual, even though some are quarterly. and then we seem to have 6 months missing for quite a few of them. And before people start thinking it's a COVID thing, it's not. I'm looking at sort of 15, 16, 17 around those. So we've got Q1 and Q2. So is there an obvious reason why we don't have those? And then the value of the gap seems very unusual. So it goes from, it starts off at 53, which then weirdly jumps to 78. Then we're sort of bobbing around the 90s. We go to 85. We jump to 117, and then we're back down to 100 before surging to 133. So they seem incredibly strange trends is the first point. The second one's a totally different one, so I'll just leave that one there.
Yeah, so you're asking me about why over the past sort of, 12, 13, 14 years has the gender pay gap jumped so significantly at different points in the year, which I can't answer, I'm afraid. So can I take that back and find out? You are right to notice so we've gone from 43.90 to 117 within a 5-year period, which would suggest a number of additional roles, maybe at a higher level for males in the city. It's probably worth noting, and I haven't got the dates, the time periods, but if we look at the new era for women entrepreneurs, some of the data that they've shared would suggest, for example, that let me just find this, I've written it down, 20.51% of females are founders of organisations compared to 78.21% of males, and that if you're looking at directors or senior leaders in an organisation, 28.9% are female and 65.85% are male. So that would account for some of the gender pay gap, though whether it's in that period of time, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, but I don't think it would, because the 3 points to make is, it says collection frequency annual when they're clearly not for some of them. We don't have half the year for several years, and there are trends for why women get paid more or less, or the differential widens, but I can't see any reason at all why it would jump from 85 to 117 pounds in 1 quarter, stay at exactly that level, give or take 30 pence for the year, and then it would drop by nearly 20%, then go up 25%, and then go down 60. So I just can't believe this data we're looking at is in any way accurate at all. So my sort of thought is we can't have a discussion really based on that, because the data must be wrong. I've said the 2 things are definitely wrong in terms of what we've got here, and those figures can't surely be right. Otherwise, it must be based on such a small sample.
So actually, small sample is an interesting point. So we are only talking about how many? I think it's 43 businesses across. It's 43 businesses that publish their gender pay gap data, of which 4 of them are negative. So that only leaves 39 that publish their gender pay gap data. This is nationally produced data. It's published. That is data that's published nationally. So it's data that we've drawn from feeds. We could talk about whether it's accurate or not, but that's not an answer I can give here, I'm afraid. It's not our data, essentially. We publish data into this, but it's not our data. Yeah.
Thank you, Claire. It's an interesting point, Chris. Sorry, Councillor Stewart. Yeah, we might be able to get into that a bit more outside of the meeting. We're not going to bottom it out tonight, but yeah, it's an interesting comment. I had Councillor Fenton next.
Thank you. Yeah, just to pick up on the last point, obviously it's not our data. We can't ask Ian Cunningham to explain it to us, because he will say quite legitimately, well, we didn't collect it. But it may be that some organisations reported in some years, not in others, and that their lack of data skewed the numbers in a certain way. Because you look at this and think there can't have been such a huge fluctuation in the gender pay gap in reality. I'd be very surprised if that was the case, but it would be helpful if Ian Cunningham or someone could at least give us a view as to the limitations of this data, because I would be very reluctant to make any kind of assumptions on the basis of what we've got. I was just wondering, Claire, in terms of, obviously this is a limited data set and it relates to figures reported by larger organisations.
Yeah.
Do we have any sense from the work that the council's team has done of what the position is in smaller firms in York? Is that something that is being looked at as part of the the work that's the UK SPF work that's mentioned in the report in terms of identifying as well as opportunities to for women to progress in either in the workforce or setting up their own businesses, what the situation is in smaller firms in York, whether through information the Federation of Small Businesses might have or other organisations. Do we have a sense of what the broader picture is outside of the bigger firms?
So I suppose the short answer is no, other than using the national data that we've got before us. The UK SPF is more looking at the, if you like, the level of women working in the workforce, the ability for them to have job shares or flexible working arrangements that allow them to obviously progress in their career maybe a bit more. So it's not so much how they get paid, but the opportunities presented to them. It's probably worth noting about the real living wage and the national wage. So the national living wage. So as you'll know, York's a good business charter city, and that by being a good business charter city, it encourages everyone to be paid the real living wage. In April this year, the real living wage will go up to £12.60 per hour. The part-time hourly rate in York at the moment is is within the lowest 10 percentile, with at £8.80 instead of the highest at £14.26. So that will help a little bit alleviate some of those issues. However, it's very difficult to have this conversation without sounding quite negative, but it's worth noting that the cost of childcare in York for half a day is £45 and for a full day is £75 per day. And if you're looking at the real living wage at £12.60 from April, that's £378 per week, which if you're working 30 hours and putting your child into full day care at £75 per day is £375, which gives you a sum total of £3 a week. So there are bigger issues at stake than just some of the things that we're trying to tackle here.
Thank you. Councillor Wycroft, you're next.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for this report. I'm just interested in the role that if there's any data that we can get about York for different protected characteristics and how that impacts on the gender pay gap. We know that different things like race and disability and indeed age, although not a protected characteristic, can play on how the gender pay gap works for different people and how different people experience it. I'm not sure if that's collected in the data that we have here, but it'd be interesting to see what role those additional characteristics and parts cause for the input. And Councillor Lomas has raised the hand.
Councillor Lomas?
Just on that, we have been doing some work on the Human Rights and Equalities Board, looking at exactly that. One of the challenges is that it's not data that's nationally collected, but the Human Rights and Equalities Board is absolutely looking at that as part of, some of you will remember from avidly reading the Human Rights Indicator report that was published last year, that gender pay gap is a real concern across the city in terms of human rights and equalities, and that's definitely a focus of that work. Happy to feed that back in once we've got some update from it.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, has there been any initial findings out of that work, or is that still no?
Not at this point.
Not
No.
at this point. Thank you.
It's due to be published soon, isn't it? The reports, the indicator report.
That's the new indicator report, but we're still looking at how we can bring together some of the organisations in the city to look at that true intersectionality of protected characteristics, so that we can examine the broader reasons why we have pay disparity.
And if I could, Chair, could ask that that's looked at when we move on to the work plan at the next agenda
Mhm.
item, please.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Merritt.
Thank you. Just on Chris Stewart's original point, I wonder what the impact of bonuses is in here. If it says it's it's median earnings, if I remember correctly, a certain well-known national house construction firm paid one of its directors a very large seven-figure sum. If you have 150k employees in York, that would probably have equated to somewhere around £150 difference that one person's bonus would have made to the annual figures. So I think what it highlights is this is probably these figures are probably not a very helpful indicator of the wider issues to a degree. I mean, obviously they do indicate something, but I think the more interesting table is the one at the in Annex 3, which looks at the different employers in York, and you can see that there are certain professions where there's quite consistently substantial differences. As half of the bottom 10 are vets practices. The NHS doesn't perform a lot better. And then there's a large number of education institutions that are in the 15s to 27%. So if we are to do anything about this, I wonder whether there's perhaps collective engagement with certain professions and industries to see what we could positively try to do, and they could positively try to do to address the gaps that we have in this city. I mean, no doubt they reflect national to a degree, but nonetheless, local action is not unimportant.
Thanks, Councillor Merritt. I mean, may I ask, does any engagement along those lines currently take place on this subject in the various forums and meetings, engagements, partnerships that we have across the city?
No, is probably the honest answer, and probably that is something we could take forward, maybe leading into the results of the Human Rights Indicator report, which is due to be published, any findings there. We have had conversations with city partners and through the IER UK about anti-racism practices and about sort of tackling discriminatory practices at that level, but that's only one protected characteristic, of course, it's not all of them. Just on that point about those organisations on that list, it's worth noting that of the 2/3 of women, people working part-time who are women, of which 40% work less than 30 hours a week, they are predominantly in public sector roles like healthcare, education, social care. I don't know if veterinary care counts as healthcare, I'm afraid. I don't know if that falls into that category, and retail and hospitality. So it's not surprising to see some of those organisations on that list.
Councillor Lomas, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, so that's exactly what the Human Rights and Equalities Board want to do, is that they want to invite in representatives from some of the groups of employers who have the biggest pay gap, to talk about what kind of measures they're taking, and to enable sharing of best practice from different employers. And I think that that would be a really crucial piece of work to do, because clearly there are some employers who are getting it more right than others in terms of pay parity. So there clearly is some best practice to share, not least from our own council as an employer.
Thanks, Councillor Lomas. That seems like a good start, really, on that sort of collective engagement point. Who's next on here? Councillor Ben Burton.
Thanks, Chair. I had a question, well, kind of question I just wanted to raise in terms of how we look at the data going forwards, in that it's focused kind of broadly across the council, and lots of the council, you know, working in the offices, you can see does work quite well in terms of gender balance and how people are treated in the workplace and other parts. But I wonder whether there's value in future to also breaking that down by departments and the actual directorates that are in there, because there are certainly parts of the council that are more challenging for women to work in. Anecdotally, parts of Hazel Court, parts of the teams in there maybe have different working practices to what we see working in West offices. And I think actually breaking down to that kind of level of detail would be useful to just make sure that we are managing to tackle those problems in perhaps some of the more traditionally male dominated environments that we have in the council. I think would be a good thing to bring up, because it can be challenging, I think, from people's experience. And then the other one was probably just following on from Councillor Merritt's point around education, I guess. I think we're probably safeguarded by the fact that we have bans in place, but I don't know whether that's the same for head teachers. But obviously one of the big challenges, having looked at this yesterday, seems to be that the main differential comes in head teachers' pay and the way that they pay the most senior people, and the fact that that's often hidden behind a bit of a wall. And I just wondered if it was worth taking away to check, how do our schools appoint head teachers, and whether you use the same practice or whether we do just continue the banding process that we use elsewhere, because I'm not clear on that, because that seems to be where a lot of that disparity comes, is where they agree pays behind closed doors, essentially, at the point of appointment, rather than in an open setting, I think.
Yeah, I can certainly take that back and ask the question. Of course, there'll be a difference between the maintained schools and the academies, and predominantly we're moving into academies.
Thank you for that. Next, I've got Councillor Healy.
Thank you very much, Chair. I thought you were going to steal my question there then, Councillor Burton, but you sort of shied away from it. Picking up on the point of there are certain areas that tend to be predominantly male and predominantly female. I note that Birmingham's still in trouble with its equal pay that it's had now for decades. We still have a situation where a predominantly male workforce that works out of Hazel Court doing waste collection tend to be on, when you finish a job, you can finish. Whereas I don't think there's any other parts of the council that may have more women in it that have a similar, I don't know, work profile. Is that an issue, or?
So I can't really talk about our HR practices. I'm just here to talk about the city, I'm afraid. HR are taking the gender pay, the published gender pay gap post-March to a scrutiny committee in April, I believe. So there'll be those conversations there. Thank you.
Okay, right, thanks.
Interesting question now, Councillor Healy. Next, I've got Councillor Vassie.
Thank you, Chair. I have to confess, I was struggling to really see the usefulness of much of this data, because there seem to be too many gaps. So, for example, if we say we encourage female entrepreneurs, which I'd support, is there data to show that female entrepreneurs treat male and female pay and the gender gap differently to other companies? Is there, given that we know that a lot of, or I certainly understand that a lot of the lower paid workers are in the retail sector, and a lot of them are employed part-time. I think it's fair to say that there are more women than men working in shops. It seems a bit difficult to have this discussion in the absence of that data to confirm whether or not female pay is influenced negatively by shop work, and whether, for example, full-time and part-time pay are partly the explanation for differences in pay and conditions. And particularly exercising to me, because I've worked in retail in the city centre, one thing that really struck me when I was working there between 2017 and 2020 was the use of 0 hours contracts. And I would suggest that that was at least as important as the amount of money that people are paid in their wages in terms of giving people the ability to have a living wage and to look after themselves and to pay their bills. So in terms of that information about business, rather than that which relates to the local authority, I was struggling to see how the data enables us to come to any meaningful conclusions or to find ways of making things better. I don't know if Claire would like to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you, councillor. So the data that's before you today is only the data from those organisations in Annex C. If for example, we're thinking about Tesco's and whether more women work in Tesco's, that data will be published wherever Tesco's headquarters is. So I don't know where that is, I'm afraid. Sorry, there we go, Hatfield. So Hatfield will report on Tesco's numbers, not York. In terms of the mix of gender occupations across the city, we do have that data, so we could bring that back to a different meeting. Like I said, I've got the 40% women work, 40% on less than 30 hours a week, and a kind of broad understanding of the mix, but we do have that data in much more detail. In fact, we shared it at the Cost of Living Summit, I think in November, I'm going to say November 22, but it might be November 23.
Thank you, Claire. Councillor Lamas.
Thanks, Chair. Just a couple of things on part-time versus full-time working. The data is adjusted for part-time working, so you wouldn't be comparing someone who works a full-time job with someone who works a part-time job. It's done on a FTE basis. But there is a significant impact of part-time working on overall earning potential, and that is definitely something that when employers get it right, it reduces the gender pay gap, because women are much more likely to work part-time. And if you offer inclusive, supportive, flexible working policies that still allow people who work part-time to progress in their career, to achieve everything they can achieve, then you reduce your pay gap, because although that person might be paid fewer pounds at the end of the month, the amount they're paid per hour will be the same as their counterparts who are working full time. So there's some really important things about part-time, full-time working. We shouldn't just kind of dismiss it because saying, well, people who work part-time, of course, they get paid less because the data is adjusted for that. Interesting that you raised retail. We also, of course, in this city, we have an awful lot of hospitality jobs, which similarly can be many people holding multiple jobs, multiple contracts, part-time contracts, or indeed 0 hours contracts. And of course, you'll know that the government are currently working on abolishing 0 hours contracts because they are so damaging and divisive. And they absolutely do limit people's earning potential and allow employers to exploit people, even if they don't go out with the intention to do so. So there's a lot of things that where you see employers that are getting it right on pay parity, they have positive, inclusive pay practices, and often unionised workforces as well, because trade unions really hold employers to account on inclusive pay practices and pay parity.
Of course.
Thank you. Thank you for all that information. I mentioned the retail sector because that's the sector I've got experience in. I'm glad to hear that discussions are taking place on the issue of 0 hours contracts. And I would simply repeat, when I was working in a fair trade shop even yet, I was regularly seeing people in tears at the end of the month because they couldn't pay their bills and they didn't know from 1 week to the next when they would be employed. And for me, that is such a pernicious, ugly way of employing people that, and I know it impacts predominantly on women, but not exclusively on women. I've seen young men in tears as well. Dealing with that issue is really important. And if we're going to see a report like this again, I think it would be helpful to have information on zero hours contracts and how they function in the city, so that we have a proper grasp on who's impacted by it.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point, Councillor Vassy. You know, it's not just about the pay packet, it's that security as well, even though they are related. Yeah, very fair. Councillor Hook?
Thank you, Chair. Just one observation, I think, because these are 200 or more employees, you've got two issues. One, if you've got a new startup, that's not going to have 200 employees. So all the efforts to get the women entrepreneurs working and helping them and supporting them to build up their businesses won't impact this for a long time to come. Also, as soon as a business is taken over by another business whose head office is somewhere else other than York, that would distort the figures completely, because, and very few shops, apart from independent shops, which won't have 200 people, would ever get in here, because there'll all be Boots in Nottingham and things like that. So that's one thing. The thing I was thinking with the City Council, because it seems, looking at the report, that you've got really good employment conditions, and I know that from seeing other things. It would be interesting to have a correlation of length of service for the women and men, because presumably you go up your band, don't you, if you stay on? And so if women stick it out for a longer time because you get all these benefits that are really pertinent to women, because you're allowed part-time caring and all that sort of stuff, then that might be why women do very well in your City Council, because they don't leave, whereas men would go somewhere else for a better job and be a bit more fickle. But that's me guessing. But you know, there are other opportunities. Yeah, so that would be just it.
All that data is published after the gender pay gap data, so that will be part of the part of the workforce development plan and part of something that HR will bring to scrutiny in April. I think might be Councillor Fenton's the corporate and customer services scrutiny, possibly. I was just going to mention,
changes all the time, doesn't it?
yeah. I was just going to mention as well, you make a really valid point, of course, about the 250 plus employees. There are 9,151 small, medium enterprises in York that don't have to report. They are, of course, the backbone of York's economy, but the New Era research showed that there is disparity around the number of founders and therefore, and also the number of female directors within those organisations.
Is that a supplementary, Councillor Stewart? Fire away.
It's not really a supplementary. Well, it's not really a question, but it does relate to the point. So
Fill your boots. Go on.
yeah. So just very much to sort of agree with, I think, Claire's point there in terms of, you know, these vast numbers of employers that are under that level. And my gut feel would be that the problems of gender pay inequality for particularly bad reasons are likely to be far more widespread in those smaller employers. And, you know, and 249 employees is still an enormous amount of employees to have, you know, a vast number. If you go lower down that, if you go to maybe sort of 5 or 6 or 7, then there's all sorts of issues there about, you know, where somebody getting pregnant can cause far more issues, you know, for that business than a company that employs thousands of people. And I think in terms of the issues of gender pay, the vast majority will be in those smaller companies where we don't have the details, we don't have the data, but I think that's, you know, where we need to be, and all sorts of, you know, unconscious bias within of sexism and those sorts of things. I think they'll be far more prevalent. So just to really add that.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. You're absolutely right. I looked it up as well. Councillor Lomas probably knows this already, but it surprised me that you were only protected as if you were pregnant or for maternity leave from 2010 with the Equalities Act, which isn't that long ago, actually, is it? So, yeah, you're absolutely right.
Thank you. And I have a supplementary on this, really, which is around those sort of networks for smaller businesses in York. Do we know if they're giving attention to this issue, such as even a body like Indie York, for example? I know there's many others. York Bid, maybe. I know they can't be expected to produce hordes and hordes of data and analyse things like a council can, but maybe avenues like that are the way to go to try and raise standards at that lower level. Do we know if they're looking at that kind of thing?
I mean, I can't answer for sure.
Yeah.
I haven't had that conversation with them directly, but I do think that is something we can take back and maybe discuss in the economic partnership, which meets every 6 months, as well as the work that the Human Rights Board are planning to do as well, so that we can maybe do a bit of a pincer movement.
Yeah. Thank you. Councillor Jane Burton, you've been very patient. Oh, forgive me. You may have to be a little bit more patient.
No, no. Very briefly, just to add to that, there's also obviously the work that's done through the Good Business Charter, which involves obviously businesses of all shapes and sizes. And I know they have been looking at this and they actually did provide a response to the Human Rights and Equalities Board.
Thank you, Councillor Lomas. Definitely Councillor Jane Burton now.
Hurrah, thank you very much. It was also to do with what Councillor Hook was saying, and I know that in my other role that disabled workers who are well treated tend to stay in their jobs, because if they get the right reasonable adjustments and they get, well treated by the firms that they're in. When I say well treated, they get really their entitlement under the law, which they don't always get. They will stay with a firm and they will be really loyal employees. And I think that ties in with what you have said as well. So I just wanted to add that. There was something else I wanted to say, but it's now gone out of my mind. So
if it comes back to your mind,
I will, yes.
Give us a shout. I just had one question. Sorry, go on. Here it is.
I was just going to also say that a lot of disabled people who are not happy with working within organisations who don't get the correct reasonable adjustments start, if they can, their own businesses and become self-employed. It would be interesting to know if you did do a breakdown, and I know an awful lot of lawyers go as sole practitioners because they face so many issues with discrimination and things are not flexible enough that they actually start their own firms. And I think it's not just with disabled lawyers, it will go across the board. And I wanted to go back also to the issue of the academies and the schools and how disappointing that is, because I know, having been a teacher, that an awful lot of the ground for workforce are women. But of course, the higher echelons of teaching, for sure that if somebody comes in as a male primary school teacher, within 5 years they'll probably be ahead, excellent female teachers will be overlooked. And that's so sad to see that reflected still, because I'm going back 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah, I think this still is the really important word there. Yeah, going back 20 years, I had the same, and here we still are having this conversation. So yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Burton. We've covered a lot of ground here. I mean, I just had one specific question about the new era for female entrepreneurship report, and there's various sort of policy considerations they're described as at the end of that. Do we know if any of that work has gone anywhere yet? I know it's not CYC. It's a University of York production, but anything on that to your knowledge?
So it's being championed and advocated by, for example, the FSB, the Chamber. We're using it to talk to and discuss with York Central, for example. So whether we could think about how York Central, the cultural strategy they're calling it, which is actually how people live and work on the site rather than necessarily what we might think of culture. So actually how it can influence some of our big developments. So it's not something that's going to sit on the shelf and get dusty. It's definitely something that will inform kind of those discussions going forward, because I think we all want to see the city that's a more equal and welcoming place for all of our protected characteristics, of course, but focusing on women today.
Thank you, Claire. Councillor Merritt.
you may not be able to answer this, Claire, but I just wondered about in terms of the work that we do with businesses, how much we deal with the skills and training side around dealing with unconscious bias and those types of issues, which both, unconscious bias has been particularly picked up for interviews in terms of equal employment opportunities. But one wonders about the same issue in terms of how pay is awarded, especially where it's individualised pay. So, as I say, I'm not sure whether you're or somebody else who would need to give the answer.
I mean, we do unconscious bias training here, of course, and we have pay scales, and the pay scales are published. And before you have a job advert, you know whether you're a grade 7 and what your pay scale is. So there's very little room in the council to sort of, well, there's no room to award individual pay. It's based on pay scale and where you sit on the pay scale when you're appointed in. So there's no sense of that, if you like, that unconscious bias around awarding pay. I can't talk for the rest of the city, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Again, is that something that relevant colleagues could,
Yeah, we can definitely take that. Yeah, we can. There's the Good Business Charter, absolutely, which does have that discussion. And I think there's probably something we can do with the economic partnership to have just like we're having now, actually, that real open conversation around how we can kind of provide a more equal playing field for the people that work in the city, all the people that work in the city, of course, informed by the Human Rights Indicator report when it's ready.
Councillor Vassie.
Thank you, Chair. To turn to the data on the City Council. Councillor Ben Burton referred to having better department information on pay within departments, I think, and exploring that and explaining that better. I have to say, when I looked at all the quartile tables, and you may consider me an old anarcho-syndicalist for saying this, what really struck me was the massive difference in pay between the lower paid and the highest paid. We have people, I presume they must be apprentices, on £6.82 an hour. And we have someone on a £78.86 an hour. That's a 12-fold difference. And I think within local authorities and local government, those kinds of differences do not fill me with joy. I don't see that as a great sign to give to the rest of the world. I also noticed that within each quartile, there is a completely different differential between the lowest paid and the highest paid in each of those quartiles. So in the lowest quartiles, the highest person is paid 86% more than the lowest paid person. In the two middle quartiles, the difference between the lowest paid and the best paid is about 25%. And then when you get to the upper quartile, the difference between the lowest paid and the highest paid is 300%. I think if we're looking at pay, yes, gender is a part of what we need to look at. But I have to say, as a human being, the massive gap between the lowest paid and the highest paid in local government seems to me disheartening, and I think a lot of other people in the wider public might find it so as well.
Councillor Lomas.
Yeah, don't disagree at all, Councillor Vassie, but I would say that the difference between the highest paid and the lowest paid in the council is actually far, far, far smaller than the vast majority of large multinational organisations, where the people at the top of the organisation are paid hundreds of times more than the people who are actually doing the work, who are actually producing anything that is of value to the organisation. So you're absolutely right. We've got a huge amount to do there. But one of the things that I think really comes out when you start looking at the gender pay gap is how we value different people's labour differently. And one of the reasons that we have a stubborn gender pay gap within our society is because we do value different people's labour differently. And I would suggest that there's no great difference in effort being put in by the people paid those very, very low wages versus the people paid those very, very high wages. The effort they put in, the labour that they devote, the amount of their own resource that they give to that is probably quite equitable. And so I think we've got a long way to go as a society until we value everyone's labour equally. And it's lovely to hear such socialism come from this side of the table. But I do think that the council gets it better than an awful lot of private organisations. And I've certainly worked for private companies, very, very large private companies, where I knew for an absolute certainty that I was being paid, you know, two figures an hour, £10, maybe £11 if I was really lucky an hour. And the people at the top of the organisation were being paid thousands of pounds an hour. And I didn't think that my labour was any different to their labour. We were just doing different tasks. And I think that, you know, when we have a society where all labour is equally valued, that will be a wonderful thing, and we'll no longer need to talk about gender pay gaps, disability pay gaps, race pay gaps. But for now, I think we should celebrate the fact that the council is getting it more right than a lot of organisations.
If I can respond briefly, Chair, very briefly.
Of course. Yeah.
I did use the word anarcho-syndicalist advisedly. I'm happy to brief anyone later. I think there are many ways of looking at this. We share the same viewpoint on the differentials in terms of pay. And again, you know, during COVID, I offered my services to the council to produce a film on recycling, which was posted in various social media platforms. The knee-jerk response in those circumstances, almost with every organisation you go to, is to say, okay, you go and talk to the person at the top in a suit and tie and talk to them about what they're doing. And I've made films across Europe and always said, no, I want to talk to the person who's doing the job. And I think what you said is quite correct, Councillor Lomas. Most people put what they can into their work. They go and do an honest day's work, and they put what they've got into doing that job. And so for me, I still say that differential of a 12 times pay gap, to me, seems wrong. I can accept that there are places that do things far worse. But I think we could be more of a flag bearer for doing things better going forwards.
I'd love to talk more with you about
Thus
this.
endeth the lesson.
Yeah. According to Google, anarcho-syndicalism is a form of anarchism. So I have a full mix tonight. But on a serious note, I share a lot of your sentiments, and I welcome Councillor Lamas's response to it too. Do any colleagues have any more questions, comments to raise on this? We've been on it for just under an hour. We're okay, thank you. Well, we'll look at recommendations then. It'd be good to move forward on this in some ways. For me, there's at least two areas that are worth a recommendation, but I'm open to other suggestions. The first, and I don't think there's going to be, I want to assume what the response will be, but I don't think there'll be much pushback from the executive member on this. But the first recommendation would be something along the lines of to find ways to improve collective engagement with large businesses across the city who aren't performing well at all in this regard, especially compared to the council. You know, going off the discussion, it sounds like that's something we'd probably be on the same page on. And then the other point, I think, which is key, and one of the omissions from this, for understandable reasons, is how we help smaller businesses sort of improve on this front. So a recommendation to improve or increase engagement with relevant small business networks in the city to see how we can support employers to improve on their gender pay gap performance. But the colleagues have any other recommendations? I know we had other points around sort of getting more clarity on the data and maybe what a future report might include. I'm not really viewing them as recommendations, but they are noted and they will inform the work plan. Sorry, Claire?
Do you want to make a recommendation for me to feed back to human resources about some of the data asks of the council data that can be fed into the report due in I believe April?
Yeah, sure
Okay.
thing. Yeah. So that's Councillor Fenton. It's definitely going to your committee.
Looking at the CSMC work plan as we speak, and
Councillor Emmett thinks it might be staffing matters and urgency.
oh well, that's not me.
Sorry, I'm
That's
sorry to
all
put you on the
I
spot.
was
Councillor
panicking
Fenton.
there.
Yeah. I'll apologise to Councillor Fenton. But yes, please, Claire. Colleagues, any other items worthy of recommendation? Councillor Whitcroft.
I know that we spoke a lot about protected characteristics and there's clearly some separate work being done in there. It might be worth sort of recommending as the committee onto the human rights work that's being done for a specific focus on wages and the impact that pay might have on inequalities that we experience. Don't know if you consider that to be a recommendation on one of your separate points. Certainly something I'll be proposing for the work plan going forward. But if we could have that as a recommendation, I think that would reflect
I'm
what we're on
comfortable
about.
with that, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Councillor Vassie.
Just to support what you said, Chair, about approaching other organisations, maybe the Chamber of Commerce and other organisations, to find out what tools might be made available to help them to address these issues and how the council might help.
Thanks, Councillor Vassie. Okay, colleagues, well, we'll wrap that item up. Thank you all for your engagement. Thank you to you, Claire, and Councillor Lomas. I'm glad we could get a good bit of time on that. So that brings us to the work plan. Sorry, I'm just flicking between different screens here. Should say we were hoping to get the item that we had penciled in on assets of community value on this meeting's agenda, but officers couldn't meet the time scales, which were admittedly quite tight, but we will get that on at the earliest opportunity. So that would have been the second item on tonight's agenda. But I think the motion passed unanimously at council or close to it. So it's worth following up on that. But you can see in the paper where we're currently at. I have to admit, I'm still waiting on feedback from relevant officers on timings for particular items. But if we don't get feedback, and while I will check, ultimately they do have to come to scrutiny to report. And I won't accept any late notice very late in the day that it's too difficult to get a report done when, people will have had months of notice once we hit the likes of May, June, July. So that's where we're at. It's obviously fluid. I've got Councillor Whitcroft, and I know the public speaker made a representation on this too. Fire away.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Chair, those are my two suggestions. The one that we just spoke about, so around the work that the Human Rights Board are doing. I'm trying to think what committee that would come under, but if we could have a specific focus on the economic impact around that and the access impact around that, I think would be a useful thing for us to discuss, given the discussion that we got out of the last agenda item. And then, the second one, just to propose around the disposal of assets that our public speaker brought up, if we could look at how we'd be doing that and scrutinise the process in place. That might be proviso on the budget passing, which I hope it will. But yes, those are the two that I would suggest.
Thank you, Councillor Whitcroft. I've got hands, Councillor Ben Burton and then Councillor Dave Merritt.
Yeah, just following up on that one and the one that was in public participation. I guess it's slightly even broader, like I mentioned about property, in that where, from my background, is this a committee that I guess the issue partly is that there isn't a committee that property matters are currently going to, which is part of the question that's being raised, isn't it? Because the property team makes up quite a sizable amount of their work, well, not a sizable amount of workforce, but they control a sizable amount of assets that we use, and there's quite a number of assets that sit under their responsibility, either vacant or things like Swinegate that we previously owned as commercial property, which we probably don't have a lot of oversight. So it's partly disposals, but it is also useful just to get an initial overview of what they see themselves as holding and what the strategy is behind that, because it kind of comes in flows depending on borrowing everything else. But yeah, I'm not aware of where that reports to currently, and this feels like a good place for it to be, but it could be anyway. But I'd be interested to hear comments on that, because I
mean, I think my initial thoughts would be either here or the CSS and corporate scrutiny, one or the other. Councillor Fenton, as chair of that committee, what do you think?
So I was looking back at previous agendas for this committee, and it was March last year. We did receive a report, update on the asset management strategy. So I think the question from officers will be, okay, you had this report a year ago.
Yeah.
What do you want to, what aspects of this report do we want to talk about in particular? So I think we would need to be more explicit.
Yeah.
We could get an updated version of this report. But if the advice from officers is, well, the policy hasn't changed, the approach hasn't changed, or they may say, due to financial considerations, there has been a change of tack, in which case there may well be some logic in having that discussion. So it's probably something maybe for yourself and the vice chair to talk to someone like Nick Collins, the head of property services, who I think kind of authored the March the March 2024 report. So I'm not saying don't do it, but it'd be good to have I think a clear idea of
I hear you.
what we want to talk about.
And I appreciate you jogging our memory. I guess what we got last year was, and this is with full respect to those behind it, was a relatively light touch paper. So yeah, I hear you on being more explicit and giving it some thought, and agree with you. So thank you for that. Councillor Merritt, I think you're next. Apologies if I've missed somebody.
No, I think I was.
Okay,
yes.
go on.
Yes, I was just wondering whether that this last topic sat under here or sat under corporate services, but I wasn't here when that paper was discussed, so I hadn't appreciated it had previously been here, so it'd be logical to continue to come here. The other thing I just wanted to pick up, looking at the future potential topics, there's quite a big chunk under the first bullet point on transport, which I think are somewhat overdue for looking at. The original BSIP is due to finish at the end of this financial year. Clearly, it has been extended since, but it would seem to me it would be an appropriate point, perhaps by the September meeting, to have that review of what the original BSIP at least has achieved against its original ambitions, but also the suggestion to look at the enhanced partnership. I just record, of course, that I do attend the enhanced partnership forum meetings as a representative of the York and District Trades Union Council, but I am well aware that there have been a number of concerns expressed by some of the stakeholders at the forum meetings about its effectiveness, how it's run, those sorts of things. So if we're looking at bus issues, I think there's a whole raft under that first bullet point that will actually form a good comprehensive meeting and opportunity to look at what's been doing in that area. The other one, obviously, is where the combined authority is going on these issues, and what, in effect, what the city council's asks should be of the combined authority in terms of what it does on transport, public transport.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Merritt. That's helpful. I'm happily work that in. Councillor Vassie? Should we do
Thank you,
something
Chair.
on anarcho-syndicalism?
No, I'm moving on. So list of future potential topics. I would support the idea that we get on with properly exploring best practice on tourism levies or tourism tax. I think the time has come for us to become aware of what can be done and where it's being done and how. I support the idea of revisiting the EV charging strategy and inputting into it. I think that would be a very useful thing.
Which is due to be published by the end of this year, I believe. So.
Yeah, and the situation changes all the time. And whatever we did a year ago, the situation has moved on. So I think it's well worth looking at again. And then I'd just like to suggest another idea for consideration, which draws on, I think, some of what I'm seeing in the list of potential topics here. But I think it would be a good thing to actually look at council-run businesses, the ways in which local authorities generate income streams, and to see what opportunities there are for York to do better. As everyone around this table, I've sat in endless meetings where people tell us what the government is giving us and what the government's not giving us, and why we can and can't do this or that. What I never really hear is how we could be earning money, whether it's from energy generation or from working with partners in universities to develop new technologies, but to actively and proactively use the assets the city has and the local authority has to generate income streams. That could also be, in the past, I tried to do it with intellectual property rights. The council owns a lot of intellectual property right across the city, but doesn't exploit it in any meaningful way, to my knowledge. So getting a bit more savvy as to how, in terms of economy, since this is an economy scrutiny committee, the council might engage with generating income that could then be used by the city, I think would be a useful thing.
Happy to include that. It'd be good to flesh it out. But yeah, be a very interesting and possibly helpful study report. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't agree with Councillor Vassie on the tourist tax point, because whilst there's all sorts of interesting things that I think will happen with tourist taxes, and indeed, Councillor Vassie, I think I left the press, didn't you, about the radical tourist solutions we could have in terms of tourist tax and a bus around city centre, wasn't there? I'm trying to.
It was a full-page article.
Full-page article. Yes, that full-page article. Those sort of things would be brilliant. However, at the moment, the tourist tax is not happening unless it's voluntary, and it's not going to be adopted in York at the moment, whether rightly or wrongly. So I think we park those. The second point about the how the council can make money from businesses, excellent. Totally agree with that. My thoughts on what we're putting this, we've got to be very, very targeted and very specific. Look at how we, as a committee or as a task group, can take a subject, look at it, make the world a better place, and move on. So on some of the things we've got on the work plan, I think they can do that. Park and ride retender. We're going to look at that. We're going to make some recommendations and move on. As opposed to, I would say with the greatest respect, the gender pay gap. I'm not seeing how the world is going to change for anything we've done tonight or we're going to do going forward, time-wise. And it's just about that specific thing. So on the point that public speaker made about the property, and how the council looks after its assets, I think it's a great example of where, whilst we have looked at it before, we've got to be specific for what we're looking at. So if we say to property officers, we'd like to talk about asset management. Then obviously they're going to come to us and say, this is broadly what we've got asset wise. These are the big projects for us at the moment, like Castle Gateway or whatever it may be. And this is an overview of what we're doing. Whereas we need the particular things we're looking at. So for example, government has been selling a lot of property. Stupid, ludicrous thing to do, in my opinion, because you're basically selling the silver. Governments can borrow at incredibly low rates. You know, we should be doing things with the assets, and it's the same with the council. The council will look to sell things to get the capital receipt when we can borrow at very, very low rates. So, you know, we should be looking to do more with it. But those are the sort of things I think we can discuss. And at the same time, you know, things like our rental portfolio, are we doing that in the best way? Are we doing that? You know, we could do with things like that. Does that meet all of our various aims in terms of equalities and everything like that? So I think there is stuff we can do, but we just got to be specific rather than property always being something just drifts along, and our assets are things that we don't really do anything with until somebody sort of comes knocking. But it's that specific thing about what do we want from the officers? The officers give it, and then we make recommendations based on that, rather than saying we're vaguely interested in this topic. Can you give us a bit of a briefing? And then, you know, we're similarly general with the recommendations.
Yeah, completely take the point, Councillor Stewart, and agree. But on the point about the gender pay gap item, now I would say, and people will disagree, and that's fine. But I think scrutiny still needs some space to look at those bigger, broader issues occasionally. But you've got to get the balance right, and everyone's version of what the right balance looks like will change. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. Anything else from colleagues? No? Well, in that case, I don't have any urgent business. So the meeting is over. Enjoy your evenings, colleagues. Thanks for your contributions. Thank you to the public speaker too.